All right. Welcome to episode 6?
I think we're on 7.
7. Okay. Episode 7. Today I'm going to be the interviewer and Johnny's going to be the interviewee. And the topic is going to be about cleaning your brain of garbage. Not mental garbage, but biological garbage.
Yes. I was just going to say that there could be metaphorical too. But this is actually literal, just your cells are crapping shit in your brain. Mm-hmm. And you need to sweep it out.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start, I guess, with a paper. You said you discovered a paper or something like this?
Yeah, there was a new paper that came out, and it's talking about how sleep waves can promote clearance in the brain.
Okay.
But before I get into all that, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about just the phenomenon of sleep itself.
Okay.
And what's known. So sleep waves, basically these are brain oscillations. Mm-hmm. And the first thing you learn about sleep when you're taking a psychology course or
like theta, delta wave.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So you get these oscillations which you can record using EEG on the surface of the brain. And you basically can record all sorts of different frequencies, right? So there's a mix of frequencies. Some neurons are synchronized at higher rates like gamma, and some neurons are synchronized at lower rates like delta and theta and everything in between. And you actually might appreciate this, but there's a lot of mathematical theory that goes into deconstructing these signals.
Like sine waves or...
Sine waves. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of the analysis we do on these is based on like the imaginary number system and how you can have a phase to the oscillation and the amplitude and how these things can overlap. So I don't know, I thought you'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I've also heard of some interesting like synchronization between like the signals from your heart and the signals from your brain, and how some of them, when they're out of alignment, that's usually when people are agitated, but when they're in alignment, it's like they're communicating. We talked last time about the vagus nerve.
Yeah. So that's newer stuff coming out, which is pretty cool. And techniques, and first of all, it's like the recording techniques to get accurate measures of these things, and then how to develop metrics to quantify the degree of this synchronization. That's cool. So like if you can think of a sine wave, right, that has some oscillatory period, and whenever like I say your heart beats, maybe your heart, for whatever biological, physiological reason, tends to beat at a certain phase in the oscillation. So maybe as the oscillation is going up to like whatever 180 degrees or whatever, that's when your heart beats, and it goes down and then comes up. It's not perfect, but you can quantify kind of the spread in which the phase locking is what it's called, of your heartbeat or any other kind of rhythm. And you can have cross-frequency coupling. And there's really interesting methods to analyze these kinds of things. So in terms of the sleep literature, that's probably the most well-known measure, is that when you're going to sleep, you have drastic changes in your brain oscillations. So when you're awake and doing things, you kind of have a more, I'd say, less synchronized, disorganized kind of oscillations, a lot more just random firing patterns that will cause a lot of more like chaotic up and down oscillations across all sorts of different frequencies. And so this signal is much more complex. If you think about just the information, if the neurons are firing at different times and they're not quite as synchronized, the information is more complex. There's more potential information you can pull out of these neurons.
And what's the general test for measuring brain waves? It's like E something?
Yeah, EEG.
EEG, right. And the EKG is your heart, right?
That's right.
So EEG is the brain, and EKG is the heart. So
yes.
Electric something?
Yeah, so it's an electroencephalogram.
Yes, okay.
And encephalo is talking about the brain part.
And then there's cardio?
Electrocardiogram. So EKG is, I think that's the Russian
Right. It should be a C.
ECG is what we call it. But
right.
It's the same thing. But yeah, so these are
Not
just
to be confused with the KGB.
I was just gonna make that comment too. But yeah, they're getting into our brain waves. No, they're just in our hearts. That's the difference. But anyways,
so we're talking about dreams, different waves.
Well, I was talking more about like what's embedded in this electroencephalogram signal.
And you said when we're conscious, it's a little more chaotic.
Yeah, I'd say it's a lot more chaotic, less synchronized. And when you have more chaotic activity and less synchronized activity, it means each individual neuron could be carrying more information. But let's say if you have a redundancy and all the neurons are firing at the same, you have like 1,000 neurons firing at the same time. That's a very simple, not complex signal. There's less information in there.
Okay.
Right? But if you have like 1,000 units and they're all like firing with different latencies, it's a much more rich, complicated
and you said
process going on.
Phase locking is when they're like in alignment
with
right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but they can be in alignment with all sorts of frequencies, and it can change. It depends. So typically, the action potentials or the spikes of the neurons they tend to phase lock with the lower oscillations. So delta is like a 1 to 4 hertz range, meaning every second, 1 hertz is 1 cycle per second. So it's like a 1, 2, 3, right? And so that's a slower time scale. But you can be synchronized to a 4 hertz phase or 10 hertz, and you can look at where it's favored. And in the brain, just in terms of general activity, when you're learning and explore, when these mice are doing it, but I think they've shown this also in humans, it's a theta gamma coupling in the hippocampus that is observed. So the theta rhythm is within the 4 to 8 hertz, and for some reason these neurons like to fire at a specific phase of theta. And those, so it's like a slow theta wave at 4 to 8 that couples with a higher gamma frequency, which is like 30 to 100 hertz. And this is the way that brain can organize information. So gamma activity, that's like 100 hertz. It's very fast. It's like chaotic and spiking. And when you're awake, that's what your EEG looks like. There's not these large synchronization events. And like I was saying, if you have more neurons that are scattered, there's more information. It's more complex to decode. But if they're all aligned up, it's basically, you could get the same information from one neuron if all 1,000 neurons are doing the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if they're synchronized, you don't need to get the signal from everybody. You just that one.
Exactly. Few. Yeah. And so that's kind of what's happening during sleep. Is that all of the buddies, the neuron buddies next to each other, are all firing at the same time and going silent, firing at the same time, going silent, and it's slow. And so with an EEG, the reason you get these really large amplitudes is because of the synchronized firing.
Okay.
So it's additive.
Like it stacks and it magnifies the signal.
Yeah. So if each one does like 1 microvolt, and you got 1,000, and they're spatially confined, and it all happens at the same time, you get a large summation of that oscillation.
I think of it like a choir kind of magnifying the volume.
Yeah, right. So if you got that's a perfect example. And if they're all synchronized in harmony, it's going to be really loud. But then you have different frequencies of like baritones. And that's why it can get kind of cool. And the sound analogy is actually really good when you're thinking about these brainwaves. So anyways, when you're asleep, these delta waves, or this non-REM sleep, I should say, this is like your deep sleep cycle. That's when all of your neurons are synchronized and doing the same thing, and it's slow. And you're not conscious when that's happening, right? You're in non-REM, meaning not even dreaming, right? You're just totally shut down. So the idea is there's less information that the brain is able to process because all the neurons are doing the same thing. It's not actually doing these complex computations, which requires, each neuron being involved in a specific task at the same time in a parallel manner. So that's like these higher frequency gamma oscillations when you're awake. So to move on from there, well, you have any more specific questions or I feel like I'm ranting a bit.
It's okay. You're given the background, and I'm trying to conceptualize it in like analogies so that makes more sense.
Yeah, the chorus thing was really good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that just kind of, and there's like, I mean, you can dice this up like in also. So there's like 5 different stages of sleep, right? You can go into deep sleep and then REM and then deep and REM and then it can get really complicated. But the main point I want to make is that when you're sleeping, you have these synchronized slow delta waves, and the goal is not to compute information at that point,
right?
And you're not conscious. It's the original idea was the reason that happens is because you're consolidating memory that you have learned in the previous day.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of studies that look at sleep quality on like creativity and all sorts of cool experiments.
And sleep deprivation.
So yeah, so there's I mean, they've done this so many different times and ways, but you can do some kind of psychological index or of learning and memory before and after sleep, or if under sleep deprived circumstances, and they've shown huge effects. So it's clear that sleep is important for learning and memory. And then I also heard creativity. You can do this in mice and humans, and it works pretty similarly. To actually conduct these kind of experiments, though, it's you have to have an experimental group and a control group, right? So the control group can go to sleep and be fine, but the experimental group, every time you start to doze off, someone pokes you or shines a light or like makes a loud noise and forces you to stay awake, basically. And yeah, as you can imagine, I mean, it's intuitive. The people who got a good night's sleep are gonna do better on memory tasks and things, but there's a physical reason of why that's happening. Is because sleep may be important for cleaning out the information that has been learned in the previous day, kind of trying to separate the signal from the noise.
Yeah.
So this is where I want to segue into a concept of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is basically just the neurons or the brain's ability to change given a context or an input. And one of the most well-known forms of synaptic plasticity is a term called long-term potentiation. I think I've maybe described this.
Fire together, wire together.
Fire together, yeah. Good old Heb. And so if these neurons are firing together, or if they're firing at a high rate, like a gamma rate, like it's 100 hertz, the synaptic communication and the intracellular pathways that are triggered with a specific higher hertz frequency will increase the synaptic strength between those neurons. So if you think about it, when you're awake, right, you have this desynchronized gamma activity, a lot of high frequency stuff going on. That type of activity generally promotes strengthening of connections between neurons. And there's a well-known pathway that requires a certain kind of channel and calcium going into the cell that triggers a whole downstream event that basically inserts more receptors, ion channels, into the synapse, so that the next time it receives the chemical communication, more channels open, and the same signal that elicited a response now is eliciting a stronger response. So these two connections are now increased. They have a long-term potentiation.
I know in terms of like personal development, one of the rules that they use, and it's hard to know how much of this is just like trial by error and then it's discovered to be backed by science, or people discover the science and then they generalize to a rule. It's called the 20-hour rule. And the idea is it takes 20 hours of focused practice to get the hang of a skill. Whatever it is, just basically you use your conscious mind and your focus and attention and just practice for 20 hours, 20 hours of focused practice to master a skill. And I'm wondering if that's part of this long-term potentiation. You're like training the neurons by your will and just doing it again and again and again, like digging those patterns or grooves in your brain.
I'm sure of it. Yeah. Well, I don't want to be that cocky. I'm very confident.
within 3 standard deviations.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and then the whole attentional system is utterly fascinating too, because then you can get like long-term potentiation just passively, unconsciously, but you can also have this powerful tool of attention where you can direct what you're wanting to learn and basically give whatever that is an extra boost in that. So if LTP is going on, it's going to happen more efficiently or whatnot.
Cool.
Yeah. So I'm trying to make a connection between the actual synaptic plasticity and the kinds of signals that can trigger the strengthening. So it's these high frequency or these gamma signals. And these are the same kind of oscillations that happen when you're awake. And if you're, so even when you're awake, there's varying levels of arousal, right? So if you're drowsy or if you're focused and intense, these, the power of these oscillations can also change. So, and the coupling between, like I said, theta and gamma and how they're phase locked can also change. So that happens in mice when they're actively exploring a maze they haven't seen before. The theta and gamma index increases significantly. And that's just an example of how organizing the brain, but also it's organizing the high frequency stimulus in a very specific way.
That's really interesting. So I might be misquoting this. I think it's Alexander Luria. He's like a Russian neuroscientist who talks about the orienting reflex. That's what he calls it. When you encounter something you don't know, it like triggers this orienting reflex, which is like, okay, where am I? What's going on?
Yeah. I don't know about the specific neuroscientist, but that's fascinating because your sub-attentional level is also able to detect things that it doesn't expect.
Right. Mismatches.
Yeah. So there's, and in the EEG literature, there's something called mismatch negativity. So like if you keep hearing the same sound over and over again, like beep, 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 when that beep, the high one happens, your brain, especially in your frontal cortex, goes like, what the hell was that? And then you can actually record that event in the brain.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And this might be too far afield. We'll come back this to a later date. One of the aesthetic theories of music is if you just have it be super repetitive, it gets boring.
Yeah.
If it's all over the place, it's chaotic.
Right.
So you want to find this happy medium between a pattern you recognize with a little bit of variation. So like, ooh, that's interesting, but then back to something that's pleasing and recognizable.
Totally. Yeah. And if you're an artist, you can also like, maybe you want to you're making a horror movie or something, or suspense movie. You're going to make music that's unexpected, weird, like not patterned.
Chords that are off and like
off key,
uncomfortable.
This is not what I'm used to. And just that in itself can create this internal emotional like state of anxiety. Or it could be beautiful in different ways, and you can toy with the listener a little bit to put them in that space. And that's why movies are great, because you got the visual going on, you got like the music and the sound, and then you have the narrative, and then they're all kind of like
and the characters, right? Because you can read their face. If they're really good actors, right, they embody the emotion and like the pain and the surprise, and like you feel their like the mirror neurons, right? You empathize with them, and then there's the music playing on your heartstrings,
right?
And then there's the dialogue, and then the scene with the mood. It's really quite complex.
It is. It's a holistic experience, and we're just scratching the surface when it comes to the brain science of a lot of this. And it's because there's just so much information going on so quickly, and it's just it's a big mountain. But for sure we can observe these things. We observe the phenomenon, how it happens, and the computations involved, and that we're still very early.
Well, what's cool for me is to like, again, we'll come back to this dream and brain cleaning in a minute here. What's fascinating to me is a lot of the stuff people have just figured out by trial and error. You know what I mean? Like people who make movies, they just like go through a whole bunch of iterations of movies, and it's like audiences like this.
Right.
And then the scientist comes along and says, why does that work exactly? And then you get to see it and like, oh, that's really cool. These like puzzle pieces fit together, and like humans just figured it out in a pragmatic sense, they're trial and error, but you
Right.
can like reverse engineer like the brain science behind it, which is cool.
Totally. Like there are some directors, like I'm thinking of like a Tarantino kind of
Hmm.
director. So when someone asks him kind of like a technical question, why did you do that? And he's usually, I just thought it was fucking cool. Whatever. Like it just felt awesome.
Yeah.
And that's his response. And he's like an amazing director, very
Hmm.
artistic. But he's not like thinking, oh, I'm gonna pull this string and do this frequency to cause my audience to feel this way.
Right.
It's just it happens.
Yeah.
And I think that's how a lot of people, um, really good like natural artists kind of operate that way.
Like on intuitive level.
Yeah. But me being more of like a experimental like scientist kind of guy, I'm fascinated that these people are stumbling onto these like strategies or organizations that make sensical physical sense, like you were mentioning.
Yeah.
And like some directors, like I think like Stanley Kubrick is more of like he's not working off of, oh, it just feels right.
Yeah, he seems more cerebral. Like he's not. I mean, he does deal with emotion, but it's more like this visual, cerebral kind of experience.
Yeah, and when you have something on the screen and someone's like in a zoom out lens, whatever, there's a reason that they're zooming out in this specific thing, and it's
Yeah.
intentional. That's the word.
Yeah,
For
it's not as intuitive. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think who's the Citizen Kane guy? He was also very much like that. But there's different styles of directors. I can't think of. He did the War of the Worlds. Orson Welles.
Yes.
Yeah. So he was also very with intent, deliberate, intentional. Yeah. But anyways, I love this because we were talking about sleep and then we went into movies and
it's intellectual jazz.
Yeah.
We just kind of go with the flow of the conversation.
So this was all to say that there can be like intuitive patterns like music and how that makes you feel and the actual structure of how those sounds are. And people can just respond and know what it is, but there's actually some underlying structure that we have no idea. But maybe we're starting to peel it apart a little bit.
Cool. So we're talking about dreams and this. If you're willing to transition now into this, what is it? The garbage clearing is like part of the.
I wasn't quite finished.
Okay.
Yeah. I do want to get there, and then even dreams is pretty cool too. So main last point I think I left off on was with this gamma activity. And when a mouse is exploring, there's like this organization between this lower frequency and higher frequencies, and this kind of activity is known to promote increased connections between these neurons. Okay, so that can be reflected, let's say, in an EEG where you have this disorganized kind of like, well, not disorganized, but high frequency stimulation. All right, so during sleep, you have these huge synchronized events that are slower. And in like a test tube or an experiment in a plate, when you have neurons, if you stimulate them at low frequency in a controlled setting, instead of having a potentiation of the signal, you actually have a reduction. It's a long-term depression. So you can increase connectivity between cells, neurons, or you can decrease them. And those things can be directly driven by the frequency in which they're active. So when they're strengthening their connections, it's this high frequency stuff. And when they're reducing their connections, it's this low frequency stuff. And these are the same kinds of brain waves that we see enhanced during, so like the high frequencies enhanced during awake and the slow frequencies are enhanced during sleep. So then the idea is, okay, so you're learning all of this stuff throughout the day, like 20 hours of intentional or whatever skill.
Focused
practice. Okay. So, but then there's also a lot of other things that you're kind of learning and you're trying to figure out what's important, what should I focus on? Because there's a lot of information coming in.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so you're learning to bowl or something. It's like, it's just all this stuff. What do you focus on? So you focus on one thing, you focus on another, then you get a better idea. And yeah, so there's a lot of information and you have to basically get the signal of the noise of what's the important aspect of what I'm doing.
Yeah.
To get good at this.
Yeah. And I would say, like, if you're learning to drive stick shift or drive, it's like your conscious mind isn't equipped to handle it. And it's like you have to hit the clutch, and then you have to hit the brake, and then you have to pull off the gas, and then change the gear, and then put the gear and let off the clutch. Like, I can describe that in words, but like it's like 4 or 5 things simultaneously, and your conscious mind can't do that at once. So you've got to like compartmentalize it and then automatize all the parts, and then when you got it all together, then it flows as like one skill when it's really not one.
It's amazing. And then it's like, then those skills can like stack. Maybe just like a prerequisite of going into the higher math courses or something. You still need to learn your basics, like how to
algebra,
feel the clutch, and then you combine them together. And then once you have that, you can keep going up, into more complex things. But even that's a good example with the driving. So there's so many different individual atomized steps. I like that terminology too, to doing these things. So what does sleep do, right? So when you're learning these things, everything is getting increased in their connectivity. And the idea is whatever the most important ones that you found and practice the most, those are going to have the strongest increased or LTP potentiation.
And I think, is it dopamine that like rewards the habit? So like you do something, there's a sense of reward, which is like, do this again.
Right. So that's a reinforcement kind of learning where the brain has an intrinsic reward system to inform you whatever you did that was good, and then it makes you feel pleasure, and then you're more likely to do it again. And it's just crazy how all this stuff is happening like parallel sequence. So the main thing I wanted to say with this before we get into the garbage cleaning is you're learning a task like 20 hours focused attention. And you're figuring out all these different aspects of whatever the thing is. Some of them are not important, but you still have a memory of it, and it's still like you're trying to figure out what's important, what's not. So you have to keep a database of all that stuff. And then the idea is during sleep, you have the slow frequency, right, stimulation, and then you have a synaptic downscaling across these neural networks. And basically, it's a Darwinian evolutionary, like survival of the fittest kind of idea, is that the connections that were the strongest and most robust during that awake period survive the synaptic downscaling during the sleep. And so the things that maybe you learned, but it's like it's not useful information,
or static,
we got to get rid of that. Or it's static, it's noise. And so this is like physical phenomenon in the brain, the neurons that are basically learning and then cleaning, learning and cleaning. But they're learning and cleaning in terms of the synaptic connectivity, the physical information.
As an analogy, I was thinking about writing, how a lot of people just do like a rough draft, and then they'll edit it, and then they'll draft, and they'll edit it.
Yes. So every day you're awake, you're out there, you're soaking up information, and at sleep, you're kind of purging or editing things out that for one reason or another, your brain has decided is not relevant or important through reinforcement, dopamine signals, and how much time you spent and how often it was, all of these things. And then you just pare everything down and then build it back up, pare it down, build it back up. And eventually there's like a statue of David, right? And you can keep chipping away at it, and it starts to form and become, more realized. So all this is to say is I find this kind of line of science and research just utterly fascinating.
Yeah.
Because of the physical properties of these cells and how they're increasing and decreasing information and connectivity. How that's observed in their like EEGs and different sleep patterns. This is one more little side thing before I get into it. So remember when we talked about earlier too, where there's different stages of sleep itself, and you go from like REM to non-REM and REM to non-REM. That's within a night's sleep. You also have multiple like increase, decrease. So in rapid eye movement, this is your dream state. And it's called paradoxical sleep. And the reason it's called paradoxical sleep is because your EEG patterns when you're dreaming look very similar to when you're awake.
Right.
So in this case, the idea is that there's replay happening, and you are whatever information survived the first LTD synaptic pruning goes now into, okay, what do we have left? And let's replay this and make sense of it and make these connections stronger. All right. And then we're going to go back into another deep sleep and then prune that, and then go back into, and so even within one night's sleep, you go up and down with like 4 or 5 times during the night.
And my understanding is that you actually have muscle inhibitors that happen when you're sleeping because you're reenacting it.
Yeah.
And when those inhibitors fail, that's where you get sleepwalking.
Yeah.
Because you're not supposed to be physically acting out what you're imagining in your mind when you're sleeping.
Yeah. And then, some evolutionary process had to figure that out. Like this up and down scaling and memory consolidation is important, but it's also important to not sleepwalk and walk off a cliff in the middle of the night. Right? So then, you got to cut off your muscles, or at least your skeletal muscles. Your heart muscle is still pretty important.
Yeah.
But it's just amazing how it all fits together in that sense. So you need a good night's sleep, but you also need all of the stages within the good night's sleep. So if you're waking up a lot during the night, it's not as good as if you can just go through all the cycles up and down, synaptic upscaling, synaptic downscaling, upscaling, downscaling. So a lot of this isn't proven. This is theory. There's a lot of supporting evidence for the synaptic scaling theory, and it's pretty exciting. But I know a lot about the plasticity side, the learning and memory, and the oscillations. So I'm drawn to that theory or idea of that's how it's working. And you can imagine different experiments you can do, right? So you can actually monitor someone's sleep, and they go into deep sleep. And then as soon as you see the REM signal coming up, you wake them up. So basically you can try to deprive them of a certain type of sleep and see how that affects. So they only get deep sleep, or majority deep sleep. And every time they go into REM, you wake them up and then they let them go back to sleep. Fascinating stuff. Anyway, talk about this for a long time. Okay, I'm ready to talk about garbage in the brain.
Okay. Garbage cleaning.
Yeah. Okay, so this was known that it happens during sleep, that during the day, right, you have these very active cells, and when a cell uses energy, just like anything else, it produces molecular byproducts. It's just like burning fuel and you get CO2 or, anything. It doesn't matter. You're going to have a byproduct and it needs to go somewhere. So if you didn't have a good sewage management system in a city, it'd be pretty disastrous. It'll be Dark Ages, literal streams of pig shit and stuff right in the middle of the street.
Yeah.
That promotes disease and death, and it's just not healthy, and the whole system just gets totally inefficient. So I think that's a good analogy for the brain too. So the brain is the most energy demanding organ in the whole body, especially by mass. So it generates the most heat and uses the most energy basically of any part of your body. That means it's making a lot of byproducts. So this builds up in the brain, and you do have cerebral spinal fluid and different kinds of things that the brain is kind of floating in. And there's a system which is kind of like a pool filter where it'll bring clean filtered cerebral spinal fluid in, and then it'll pull the extra waste out. But what this paper was pretty much showing is that when you have this desynchronized gamma activity in the EEG, what's happening is...
And maybe we can link that in the description.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Definitely put it in the description. What's happening is that this desynchronized... Okay, before I go there, let me just say... So in this paper, you can think of a brainwave as kind of like a literal ocean wave. And for some people who are familiar with a scientific process called electrophoresis, what you can do is you can put and you've probably even seen these gels when they do DNA testing, and they have these little stripes that go down. So the way that happens is they load up a bunch of DNA material at the top, and they have a dye on it. And then they run a current, negative current to positive current. And these DNA, or these molecules, have some kind of electric charge. So basically, they're going to be pulled along the electrical gradient from negative to positive, and they ride this current wave, let's say. And if you're a very light molecule, you don't need as much energy, so you'll go farther down. If you're very dense and heavy, it's going to take a lot more time for you to move. So what you can do is when you see these like little stripes on the gels, it's because they've separated out the different molecules based on their weight, their molecular weight. And then each band represents a specific unique molecule because they all have different weights. So that general principle is basically what is happening. That's what this paper showed, what's happening in the brain for this garbage clearance. So you have all this garbage, and if you have lots of little tiny ripples like raindrops on the surface of the water, and these waves are just going off all randomly, and you had some particles floating, they're just going to kind of like, they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to be pushed this way, that way, this way. There's no actual direction. But if you have like a big wave that's happening, that's pushing up and down with large amplitudes, like a leaf or whatever, is going to be pushed away from the origin.
Like the surf.
Like this on the side of a wave for surfing.
Pushes it out.
Yeah, and big waves can push much more effectively rather than these little tiny waves. And so they showed that very convincingly with some very elegant experiments in mice. So, and that was the first time. So they knew that clearance happened during sleep, but they didn't know
like the mechanism.
And to me, it just blew my mind that the mechanism was an electrical oscillation that was physically moving this stuff out of the brain. And it was also promoting fluid to come in. So there's a two-step function for me that's really, really cool, is that these same waves are shaping the synaptic plasticity and information that's important for learning and memory. That same exact phenomenon is what's important for also clearing out these garbage molecules. So it's like
a 2-for-1.
2-for-1 super efficient thing. And it's like time and time again you learn about these things and you're just like, nature is just mind-boggling.
Right.
Like, why did it happen to not know, but it just came up with this solution, and then it was serving a double purpose. So it's like mega efficient.
Yeah, very elegant.
Yeah. So, anyways, that's my plug on that paper, which I thought was very cool, and also the EEG literature.
Nice.
Yeah. You have any other comments?
Well, mostly I'm looking for understanding.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like you have this junk that builds up in your brain, and part of that is extra synaptic connections that you don't need, and part of it's also waste products from processing. And so this cleaning happens that both diminishes unnecessary connections and gets rid of the waste material at the same time.
Correct. Yes. So this paper just talked about the waste material, and all the other stuff is a theoretical framework. Tononi is the big guy who has been promoting that, but I'm a believer. I mean, you see it in so many different ways. You can do it in individual cells that have been cultured. You can do it in tissue. You can do it in vivo, meaning in the living organism. You can stimulate, artificially cause it to happen. It just makes a lot of sense. And then seeing this on top of it makes even more sense. And this could have some really cool practical applications as well. So it's like, okay, if these slow wave oscillations can help clear out material better, can we induce that artificially on demand or something like that?
Or even develop treatments, like if someone has a sleep disorder or a learning disability, like maybe you could figure out how to like prime the pump, let's say, or like maybe the neurological equivalent of like kidney dialysis. Like it's not happening natural, so we're going to help the process along.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, as a scientist, when you have like an understanding of how this works, then it's like, okay, I'm an experimentalist. How can I interject in this closed loop system and make a change and see what happens downstream that can be beneficial?
Right, and I guess that's what the like engineering entrepreneur types would do.
Yeah, exactly. So,
talking about you, Elon Musk.
Mass respect. Yeah, so this like these low frequency oscillations, right? They happen. And what does the doctor say when you're sick? Now go home. get rest, get sleep.
Right.
So when you're sick,
Chicken soup and bed rest.
yeah, you have a lot of inflammatory responses.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of like cellular stuff happening, and like they're killing bacteria, and this bacteria just is basically laced into garbage shit everywhere, and you need to get that out. So that's why sleep could be, at least in the brain. In the rest of the body, you don't have all these neurons firing in these delta waves, but you get neural inflammation too with the different kinds of disorders and diseases. Okay, so this will go back to our music thing. So the first thing I thought of, so I was studying Fragile X syndrome in my previous postdoc, and what we would do is we'd play sounds, and we'd play sounds at specific oscillations. And what you can do is, like, if you play, let's say, a 40 hertz oscillation, so it sounds like a zipper, it's like bzzz, or like brrr, but it's at 40 times a second. You just keep playing it to the mouse's ear, but we did it, or another group that we were collaborating with at Cincinnati Children's Hospital did it in humans. And then you can record their EEGs. And so what happens is that you can actually push the brain oscillations into a state that matches the sensory input frequency that you're giving them. So if you play this 40 hertz oscillation in their ear like 300 times, in that time, you can record the brain activity, and you can see a 40 hertz oscillation, synchronized oscillation across the brain. So what if you played a delta wave, like 1 to 4 hertz, and you artificially, with using sound, induce these slow wave oscillations, you produce these synchronized waves, and maybe that could help clean the garbage. But just the fact that maybe even sound could be something that could be used to promote that kind of activity.
Yeah, or I've also seen some weird magnetic stuff where you can like target like specific parts with like a magnetic pulse. And
yeah, transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Yes,
that's just wild stuff. Yeah, it's so cool. But anyways, yeah, things I think about. Oh, you can also do it with light. So if you flash light at different frequencies. Yeah. Another thing too is when you close your eyes, you have a huge alpha wave oscillation that occurs, and that's supposed to be relaxing, right? So if you play a sound that's at a 12 hertz oscillation, it tends to be pleasing. So their sensory input can be directly modulating the way your brain waves are functioning in ways that were surprising to me, at least.
Cool stuff.
Yeah. Any other questions or insight? I'm curious of like what do you think about a lot of this, like sleep and.
So I'm in the middle of reading this book called Shamanism, biopsychosocial paradigm of consciousness and healing. By this guy named Winkleman. Biopsychosocial paradigm of consciousness and healing.
I like it. It's very holistic. Because we talked about the whole gestalt is important, right?
Yeah. And I'm only like a third of the way through, and it's at times very technical and overwhelming, but it's absolutely fascinating. And maybe once I finish it, we can discuss some of the topics in there.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I'll do my best to navigate that space. I'm comfortable in what we just talked about, but yeah, I can get...
It's exploration, man.
Yeah, it's fun. Gotta do that LTP during the day and glean something after you're done sleeping.
What's a long-term potentiation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Learning the code.
So, just to go on another topic of like, sleep and consciousness is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And then I know you're really interested into like myth and legend and the collective unconscious and how, dreams could play a role in that.
Yeah.
Right. So in the scientific literature, just in terms of like the way these neurons are acting, you have this like replay that's happening during this rapid eye movement. And they can actually see, they've done this, it's really cool in mice. When they go down a maze, they have like certain visual objects. Well, not a maze, it's just a hallway. They keep going down the hallway again and again during the day, and there's like, I don't know, a star over here and a little circle here, or different colors. And as they're going down, you can record from certain cells, and every time they pass one of those shapes, they can get a firing activity. Okay, so they did that. And then what they did is they let the mouse go to sleep and record it from those exact same cells. And what they noted is that those exact same cells, when the mouse was undergoing rapid eye movement, those exact cells like fired as if it was physically going down the hallway. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And they were able to see, and then not only that, but it happened at like 100 times the speed or something.
Yeah. And well, in dreams, there's this thing called time distortion, where you can be dreaming for like 10 minutes and it feels like an hour.
Yes, exactly. So like you have like this like spike, 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 and each like thing represents a different thing in that maze, that long maze. But when they replay it during dreaming, it's just like it's like a burst. But if you stretch it out, it's the same relationship and time pattern.
It's almost like data compression.
Yeah.
Like a zip file.
Yeah. And then the idea is if during REM, if you keep hitting this again and again, you're going to be potentiating those memories. And then when you wake up, you're going to see that hallway. And you're like, oh, the yellow star's here. And then, that's happening.
Well, one of the things this book mentioned was this idea of brain processing being symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily in a visual sense, it could be, or a written sense like a word, but more this idea of a zip file, where you have like this big thing, you compress it, and then you label it with a symbol. And so if you're to translate that into like dream interpretation, then you could say, okay, this symbol means this zip file.
Wow.
And
then all the information that goes in that folder could be a lot.
Yeah. And I haven't gotten there, but I think if you're looking at this from like a clinical perspective, a trauma is a sort of zip file where you have this experience and your brain's like, okay, we're going to compartmentalize this and put it over here.
Yeah.
And if you want to heal it, you kind of have to like unzip it, repair it, and then put it back.
Reminds me of Dr. Sleep a little bit. Remember that little, like, he put those monsters in the boxes and he was unconscious?
Yeah.
Put him away.
Yeah.
But then eventually, right, he had to open it up and deal with all that or whatever. That was cool. But the other thing I think is fascinating too, and maybe you probably know more about this, is like our dreams tend to be really visual.
Yeah.
So even though we might be having some kind of like emotional like thing, it's like a visual representation of some other information, right?
Yeah. Well, and the idea, I think, is phylogenetically the visual system is a lot older than the linguistic system. So you're processing like deeper layers when it's visual and emotional.
Yeah, I almost think of it like when you're awake and your eyes are open, right? Your visual input, your visual centers are getting that information from your eyes. Now that you're closed, you still have a visual input center in your occipital, but now you unplugged your like camera and you plugged in some other input that's coming from some other source. And then that's then being projected in a visual space, even though the information is maybe emotional or psychological or something along those lines.
I was watching this interview with Peterson. He's talking about reading, and he was saying that reading neurologically triggers the sort of the hearing neurons in the brain. And the idea is that like you're translating a visual signal into an auditory signal because naturally our language processing center is auditory. And then he says after that, then it triggers the imagination centers, which is how you read like a fantasy novel, right? You take the words, you translate it into language, and then it engages your imagination. And that's really cool.
Right. And when you think about it like a literal flow of information, the photons coming in and then translating it. The thing I've also heard, and I think you've actually might have experience with this, is if you want to like learn speed reading, you have to shut down that like auditory interpretation, right?
Right. So you want to like get from the visual into the imagination.
and skip that thing. I don't even have a concept of how that's possible because I'm so ingrained into like reading in my head, like the active narrative. But I know people can do that, and it just seems like some kind of crazy. They're literally like unplugging it from the auditory thing and just going straight into understanding.
Yeah. Well, and I know when I'm trying to learn language, like when I was learning Spanish, one of the things people try to do is they're like, how do you say this in Spanish? And you're like taking experience English Spanish.
Yeah.
And what you want to do ideally is just like block out the English from your brain and connect experience to Spanish. And then your brain will figure out the language. I mean, that's how we learn as children. It's like, and if you can replicate that, you can learn a lot faster.
Totally. But then there's like you have to get over your own psychological, like, oh, but I understand English and I can, it's so much easier.
For sure. Well, and getting back to my expertise, that's a lot of what math is. It's like you're using this awkward scaffolding and bad habits to do math, and you want to learn how to do it more like a clean and efficient way, but you also have to get the bad habits out of the way.
Right.
So it's like a 2-for-1 deal.
Right.
And that can definitely be challenging because people use like crutches or like mental structures that work in some situations, but they don't work in other situations. And when they encounter a problem they don't understand, and the thing that worked in the past doesn't work, they get really frustrated. It's like, well, your intermediary structure isn't working because you made some assumptions that weren't true, that sometimes work, but now they don't. So then you got to like expand your mental toolbox.
Yeah. So if you keep relying on those, like maybe you found like one trick and you just keep using the same trick every time to answer every question.
Yeah.
It'll get you somewhere, but you're going to have unanswerable or unsolvable problems because that trick is so not, going to cut it.
Yeah. So it could be ignorance in terms of the technique, but it also could be a faulty technique, right? Or a faulty strategy. And both need to be changed if you want to do math more fluidly or more effectively.
Totally. But when it comes to the reality of like students in math courses or just learning or me just learning something, like if I know a trick and it works and I have an assignment that I need to turn in tomorrow by 9 a.m., it's just, man, I just one last time, I'll just do my tricky thing and I don't really understand it, but I can get it and turn it in.
Yeah. Well, it's tough because, you have a class of like 50 students or whatever, and like some of them, like this is their last class and they're just like, I'm never using this again. Just how do I pass the class?
Right.
And on the other extreme, you have people like, I want to go to grad school. Like I want to get an advanced degree. So for those people, you're laying a foundation for, further stuff in the future.
Right.
And ideally you want to remove all the roadblocks and like the bumps so they don't have to relearn stuff, and you like empower them for a cleaner journey in the future, and it's tricky to balance those things.
Yeah. Like one is just like, I'm going to manufacture a product and this is my skill and I'm going to do that skill and that's it. And so you just trained on how. And then there's like, if you want to do innovation or think about making things more efficient or being more creative, you need to understand the hows and then understand how they connect.
Yeah, well, and just to give some grace and understanding to like a high school teacher, right? You're teaching kids algebra. Like, what are they going to do with it? Are they going to get a bachelor's degree? They're not going to use it ever.
Yeah.
And then you have administrators who say, well, we're going to teach like a different curriculum. Like we're going to do, some experiential learning, or I'm trying to think of what it's called. Common Core. Like this is how we're going to teach it. It's like, well, you don't know what the students need, and they don't even know what they need. So it's like, how are we going to present this material?
Yeah. Man.
It's a complex.
It's a very complex
challenge.
Because there's cultural issues involved and values and all that sort of thing. Yeah, what to teach and why, and then all of a sudden there's going to be some opinions that people are going to disagree with.
Yeah, I mean, and it's rough because, and Peterson was talking about this, like we have all the technology to teach people to read really well, really fast. Like we have all that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question is, how can we get that into schools so that students can benefit from that?
Yeah.
It's a distribution problem.
Mm-hmm. That seems to be it's kind of like, I remember growing up going to elementary school. That's basically what it was. It was just teaching you the skills. And there was no, when you get into history, it gets a little weird, but reading, writing, arithmetic, right? That's kind of the thing that should be focused on. But I don't know. It's a crazy social experiment going on right now. I guess we'll see how things turn out.
Yeah, and the rate of technology is advancing so fast. It's like we have so much technology and all these cool things that we could be doing. And then you want to balance that with human capacity. Like, so, talking about the high school teacher, like, let's say you just spent, 3 years on a teacher credential program, and then you were an intern serving as a learning student teacher, and then you get into your class and you're qualified to teach, and then what do? Do you say, okay, yeah, so all that stuff you learned, we're going to update it now, we're not using that anymore? Or do you say, well, okay, we're going to slightly change what you learned? Right. And there's this human element where people only learn at a certain rate. So, like, how long is it going to take before the innovation gets to the teacher, gets to the students?
Yeah. And if it's accelerating, it's not going to get better before it gets worse.
Right. Yeah. So there's this practical speed limit, it seems like.
Yeah. So now I'm thinking maybe let the technology do what it does well, which is reproduce like consistent things en masse. Like teaching the technical skill of the
right,
and not the why and the how. That's like what humans can do, right? The understanding the causes and effects and relationships and thinking more abstractly and the why. You can't ask a computer to do that yet, but maybe it'll be getting there. But that's what humans can do. So maybe teaching, certain kinds of teaching, you can do a lot of automation with that. Like there's a lot of
and
online learning.
And I think that's going to be the key balance is what do you automate versus what do you do in person? Because what you practice, you're learning a skill, right? You're programming it into your brain. And what skills do you want to master and what can you outsource? What should you outsource?
Yeah. Sorry, I just had an image pop into my brain from a movie we saw recently. And I think it was called I Am Mother.
Oh, yes.
And so there's like this literal mother robot like holding this human child. It's like, I love you. And I'm like, there are some things we need to automate and maybe some things not.
Right. Yeah.
Like robot mother.
Right. Well, and I would say like outsourcing moral decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. That gets really crazy in terms of like, what philosophies are there? What is there absolute moral standards?
Oh, well, man. And that conflict has been in education for a long time. It's like, what's the parents' responsibility to teach their kids versus public school? Like sex education, for example. Like, what is that the family domain or is that public education domain? And like, what's the appropriate age? So like these questions aren't necessarily new. It's just now there's a technological element to it as well.
Yeah, and there's always going to be pieces that don't fit quite right for everyone. It's what's going to be the best solution overall. I don't know. It's a crazy world. Interesting though.
Yeah,
fascinating.
Maybe next time we'll talk about AI and shamanism.
Is that a thing?
I don't know.
Okay. Oh my gosh, this is like some kind of Matrix thing.
That's mythology and AI. We must consult the oracle.
Sounds like you're giving the computer a like LSD or something. Have them go on a spirit trip.
All right. Well, I think we've hit the hour mark. Yeah.
At least. Yeah. I think that was fun. And thanks for putting up with my techno garble. I just get really excited about it.
No, it's not putting up. Like maybe next time we can just go more in depth on one thing and like just focus on that.
Yeah.
So maybe we should have given it more attention, you know?
Maybe, right, yeah. It's just this paper reminded me of all this other cool stuff. And want to explain my appreciation for it with all of this background information. So
cool.
But yeah, we'll see what's going on next time. I'd like to, maybe you can have a book or an article or something we can dissect.
For sure.
Cool. All right, well, I think that's it then.
All right, see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.